July 4, 1942, Captain John Broome stood on the bridge of HMS Keppel, reading a signal that made no sense. The message from the British Admiralty was clear but impossible. Convoy is to scatter. Broome was a veteran Royal Navy officer, 20 years of experience commanding destroyers in 2 wars. He knew convoy tactics. He knew Arctic operations. He knew that scattering a convoy was suicide. The whole point of convoy escort was keeping ships together where destroyers could protect them. Scattering meant sending 35 merchant ships in different directions with no protection against German U-boats, aircraft, and surface raiders. Broome read the signal again, hoping he had misunderstood. He hadn't. The Admiralty was ordering convoy PQ-17 to break formation and scatter, every ship for itself, run for the Soviet ports individually, abandon mutual protection. Broome knew what this meant. Most of these ships would be sunk. Most of these men would die. He had no choice. Orders were orders. At 21:36 hours, Broome transmitted the signal to the convoy. Convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. Within minutes, 35 merchant ships turned away from each other and headed in different directions across the Arctic Ocean. The convoy that had stayed together for 6 days through submarine attacks and air raids was now 35 isolated targets. German forces hunted them down one by one. Over the next week, 24 ships were sunk, 153 men died, 430 tanks, 210 aircraft, 90,316 tons of cargo went to the bottom. It was the worst disaster in Arctic convoy history. And it happened because someone in London made a wrong decision based on incomplete intelligence. The Arctic convoys were born from desperation. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union with 3 million men, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft. The Wehrmacht smashed through Soviet defenses and drove deep into Russia, encircling entire armies, destroying thousands of tanks and aircraft. By December 1941, German forces were at the gates of Moscow. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Britain and the United States had no way to help directly. There was no Western Front yet. D-Day was 3 years away. The only way to keep the Soviet Union in the war was to send supplies by sea, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, raw materials, everything Stalin needed to keep fighting. But there was only one route that could deliver supplies year-round, the Arctic route from Iceland to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk in northern Russia. The Arctic route was hell. Convoys sailed north of Norway, passing within 300 miles of German air bases and U-boat pens. The weather was brutal, freezing temperatures, storms that could tear ships apart, ice that built up on decks and made ships top-heavy. In summer, there was 24-hour daylight, which meant German aircraft could attack around the clock. In winter, there was 24-hour darkness, but the ice pack pushed convoys closer to the Norwegian coast and into range of German forces. The convoys were designated PQ, going to Russia, QP, returning to Britain. By summer 1942, the Germans knew the convoy routes, knew the schedules, and were concentrating forces to destroy them. Every convoy that sailed was attacked by U-boats, aircraft, and sometimes surface ships. The losses were mounting, but stopping the convoys meant abandoning the Soviet Union, and that meant losing the war. Convoy PQ-17 was the 17th eastbound convoy to sail for Russia. It assembled in Hvalfjord, Iceland, in late June 1942. The convoy consisted of 35 merchant ships, 22 American, 8 British, 2 Soviet, 2 Panamanian, 1 Dutch. They carried 297 aircraft, 594 tanks, 4,246 trucks and vehicles, and 156,000 tons of general cargo, including ammunition, food, and raw materials. The cargo was worth millions of dollars. More importantly, it represented months of production that the Soviet Union desperately needed. The escort was the strongest ever assigned to an Arctic convoy. 6 destroyers led by Captain Broom on HMS Keppel, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 armed trawlers, 2 anti-aircraft ships, 2 submarines, a close escort of 15 warships staying with the convoy all the way to Russia. Additionally, a cruiser covering force of 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers would sail nearby to protect against German surface raiders. Further out, the British home fleet with 2 battleships and an aircraft carrier would provide distant cover in case the German battleship Tirpitz sortied from Norwegian waters. The planners knew this convoy would be targeted. Intelligence indicated the Germans were preparing a major operation. Extra escorts were assigned. The Royal Navy was taking every precaution. What they didn't anticipate was that their own orders would destroy the convoy more effectively than any German attack. Convoy PQ-17 departed Valfjord, Iceland, on June 27, 1942. The weather was clear and cold. The sea was calm. The ships formed up in columns, 9 columns wide, 4 or 5 ships per column. Merchant ships were mixed. Old tramp steamers next to modern cargo vessels, American Liberty ships next to British freighters. The escorts took position around the convoy perimeter. The 2 anti-aircraft ships, HMS Palomares and HMS Poza Rica, positioned themselves in the center where they could protect the whole convoy. The first 2 days were uneventful. The convoy sailed north from Iceland, then turned east toward the Arctic Ocean. The ships maintained radio silence. Lookouts watched for periscopes and aircraft. The weather held. By June 29th, the convoy had passed Jan Mayen Island and was entering the Barents Sea. They were now within range of German reconnaissance aircraft based in northern Norway. At 14 hours on June 30th, a German Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor reconnaissance aircraft appeared on the horizon. The plane circled the convoy just out of anti-aircraft range, counting ships, noting position and course. The escorts opened fire but scored no hits. The Condor transmitted a contact report and disappeared. The Germans now knew exactly where PQ-17 was and where it was going. The first attack came at 19 Ost hours on July 1st. 3 German Heinkel He 111 torpedo bombers approached at low altitude. The escorts opened fire with every gun. The merchant ships maneuvered violently, turning to present narrow targets to the incoming torpedoes. The anti-aircraft ships threw up a wall of fire. 1 bomber was hit and crashed into the sea. The other 2 launched torpedoes and escaped. All torpedoes missed. First attack repelled. On July 2nd, the attacks intensified. German aircraft appeared in waves throughout the day. Bombers, torpedo planes, reconnaissance aircraft. The convoy's anti-aircraft fire shot down several aircraft but couldn't stop them all. At 1400 hours, a torpedo struck the American freighter SS Christopher Newport. The ship was abandoned but stayed afloat. A Soviet tanker took off the crew. HMS Keppel sank the derelict with gunfire to prevent it from becoming a navigation hazard. At 1830 hours, dive bombers attacked. The escorts threw up a smoke screen to hide the convoy. Bombs fell blindly into the smoke. One struck the British freighter SS Navarino, which caught fire and had to be abandoned. The crew was rescued by escorts, 2 ships down, 33 remaining. July 3rd brought more attacks. U-boats were now joining the assault. At 0330 hours, a torpedo struck the American freighter SS William Hooper. The explosion blew off the bow. The ship sank in 7 minutes. 3 men died. The rest were rescued by an escort. At 20:50 hours, another U-boat attack sank the Soviet tanker Azerbaijan. The convoy was now down to 31 ships, but the convoy was still together. The escorts were doing their job. Ships were being hit, but the majority were getting through. Captain Broom estimated that with continued escort protection, at least 25 ships would reach Russia. Losses were acceptable given the strategic importance of the cargo. The convoy was working. Then came the signal that changed everything. In London, the Admiralty was tracking convoy PQ-17's progress with growing alarm. Intelligence reports indicated that the German battleship Tirpitz had left her anchorage in Trondheim, Norway. Tirpitz was the most powerful warship in the European theater, 45,000 tons, 8 15-inch guns, capable of 30 knots. If Tirpitz attacked PQ-17, the convoy escorts stood no chance. Even the cruiser covering force couldn't fight a battleship. Only the distant battleship force could stop Tirpitz, but they were 300 miles away. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, was personally monitoring the situation from the Admiralty War Room. Pound was 65 years old, a veteran of World War I, a cautious and methodical officer who carried the weight of the Royal Navy on his shoulders. He had lost ships to German surface raiders before. He was terrified of losing an entire convoy to Tirpitz. At 20:30 hours on July 4th, Pound received an intelligence update. Tirpitz had been spotted moving north from Trondheim with the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 6 destroyers. The German force was heading toward the convoy's position. Estimated time to intercept, less than 24 hours. Pound faced a decision. Option 1, keep the convoy together and hope the escorts could hold off Tirpitz long enough for the battleship covering force to arrive. Option 2, scatter the convoy and order the cruisers and destroyers to withdraw, hoping that individual merchant ships would be harder to find than a concentrated target. Pound asked his staff for recommendations. Most opposed scattering. Convoys worked because escorts could protect multiple ships simultaneously. Scattered ships were defenseless against U-boats and aircraft. But Pound was fixated on Tirpitz. He believed the battleship would slaughter the convoy if it arrived while the ships were still together. At 21:11 hours, he made his decision. The signal went out. Most immediate. Cruiser force withdraw to westward at high speed. 11 minutes later, a second signal. Immediate. Owing to threat from surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. 4 minutes after that, a third signal corrected disperse to scatter. Disperse meant split into groups. Scatter meant every ship for itself. On HMS Keppel, Captain Broom read the signals in disbelief. The Admiralty was pulling the cruisers back. The cruisers were the only ships that could fight Tirpitz, even if they couldn't win. Pulling them back made sense if Tirpitz was close. But scattering the convoy? That was insane. Without escorts, the merchant ships would be slaughtered by U-boats and aircraft. Broom drafted a signal, questioning the order, but never sent it. You didn't question the Admiralty during combat operations. If Pound said scatter, there must be a good reason. At 21:36 hours, Broom transmitted the order to the convoy. Convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. The merchant ship captains were stunned. They had stayed together for 6 days. They had fought off submarines and aircraft. They were only 800 miles from Murmansk. Now they were being ordered to scatter? Many captains assumed Tirpitz must be just over the horizon. Why else would the Admiralty issue such an order? Within 30 minutes, 31 merchant ships turned away from each other and headed in different directions. Some went northeast toward Novaya Zemlya. Some went southeast toward the Russian coast. Some tried to hide near pack ice. Some just ran at maximum speed, hoping to reach port before being found. The escorts withdrew, following their orders to return to Iceland. The convoy that had been a coordinated defensive formation was now 31 isolated targets scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The Germans couldn't believe their luck. The first ship died at 0130 hours on July 5th, less than 4 hours after the scatter order. U-334 torpedoed the American freighter SS Carleton. The ship sank quickly. 27 men went into the lifeboats. The water temperature was 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia would kill anyone in the water within minutes. The survivors rowed toward where they hoped land might be. They were 400 miles from the nearest shore. At 0530 hours, U-88 sank the American Liberty ship SS Peter Kerr. 38 men abandoned ship into lifeboats. They could see other merchant ships on the horizon, also scattered, also alone, also running for their lives. At uttered 8:15 hours, German Ju-88 bombers found a group of 5 merchant ships trying to hide near the ice pack. The ships had no escorts, no anti-aircraft support except their own light weapons. The bombers attacked in waves. The American freighter SS Fairfield City was hit by 3 bombs and sank within 10 minutes. 15 men died. The survivors clung to wreckage in freezing water. The Dutch freighter SS Paulus Potter was hit by dive bombers and caught fire. The crew abandoned ship. The bombers strafed the lifeboats. 7 men were killed by machine gun fire. The survivors watched their ship burn for 3 hours before she finally sank. By noon on July 5th, 8 ships had been sunk. The Germans were systematically hunting down the scattered vessels. U-boats patrolled likely routes to Russian ports. Aircraft flew search patterns, finding isolated ships and calling in bombers. It was target practice. The merchant ships had no defense. They could only run and hope. The American freighter SS Olopana tried to hide in fog near the ice pack. A U-boat found her at 14 hours, 2 torpedoes. The ship broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. 32 men made it to lifeboats. They rowed toward the ice, hoping to reach solid pack ice where they could abandon the boats and walk toward land. They were never seen again. The British freighter SS Earlston was caught by dive bombers at 1630 hours, 5 direct hits. The ship disintegrated. 41 men died. 3 survivors were picked up 5 days later by a Soviet patrol boat. They reported watching other ships burn on the horizon, hearing distant explosions, seeing aircraft everywhere. The Soviet freighter SS Donbass tried to fight back. She had 2 anti-aircraft guns and a crew that refused to surrender. When German bombers attacked at 18 hours, Donbass shot down 1 aircraft before being hit by multiple bombs. The ship caught fire but stayed afloat. The crew fought the fires for 6 hours before abandoning ship. The captain was last to leave. Donbass sank at midnight on July 5th. July 6th was worse. German aircraft had full daylight, 24 hours of visibility in the Arctic summer. They found scattered ships everywhere. The American Liberty ship SS Samuel Chase was bombed and sank at 0400 hours. The American freighter SS John Witherspoon went down at 0730 hours. The British freighter SS River Afton was torpedoed at 11 hours. The Panamanian freighter SS Alcoa Ranger was dive-bombed and sunk at 1430 hours. Some ships tried to turn back west, away from the German air bases. They were caught by U-boats. The American freighter SS Honomu was torpedoed at 1630 hours on July 6th. 35 men went into lifeboats. They drifted for 8 days before being rescued by a British minesweeper. 4 men died from exposure in the boats. By the end of July 6th, 17 ships had been sunk. 14 remained, scattered across 1,000 miles of ocean, still 500 miles from safety, with German forces hunting them relentlessly. July 7th brought no relief. The attacks continued. The American freighter SS Pancraft was bombed at 8:30 hours. The American Liberty ship SS Pan Atlantic went down at 12 hours. The British freighter SS Bolton Castle was torpedoed at 15 hours. 20 ships sunk, 11 remaining. The surviving ships were using every trick they could think of. Some hugged the ice pack, hoping the white ice would camouflage them from aircraft. Some painted their hulls white with whatever paint they had aboard. Some ran close to shore in shallow water where U-boats couldn't follow. Some just ran at maximum speed, burning fuel recklessly, hoping to reach port before being found. The American Liberty ship SS Benjamin Harrison painted herself white, hid in pack ice for 3 days, then made a dash for Novaya Zemlya. She ran aground near the coast, offloaded her cargo onto the beach, then refloated and limped into Arkhangelsk. Cargo saved, ship damaged but salvageable, crew alive. The Soviet freighter SS Azerbaijan tried to hide among icebergs. German bombers found her on July 8th. 5 bombs. The ship exploded, no survivors. By July 10th, 24 ships had been sunk. Only 11 had reached Soviet ports. Of the 11 that survived, several were damaged and barely seaworthy. The Germans had destroyed more than 2/3 of the convoy without ever deploying Tirpitz. The bitter irony of convoy PQ-17 is that Tirpitz never came close to attacking. The German battleship had indeed left Trondheim on July 4th, but she was under strict orders not to engage unless conditions were perfect. Admiral Raeder, commander of the German Navy, feared losing Tirpitz more than he wanted to sink merchant ships. The battleship's mere existence tied down British capital ships. Actually risking her in combat was something Hitler would only authorize if success was guaranteed. On July 5th, German reconnaissance aircraft reported that PQ-17 had scattered and the British cruisers had withdrawn. The Luftwaffe and U-boats were destroying merchant ships at no risk. There was no need to risk Tirpitz. Admiral Schneewind, commanding the German task force, received orders to return to port. Tirpitz turned around and sailed back to Trondheim without firing a shot. She had been at sea for less than 24 hours and never came within 300 miles of any convoy ship. British intelligence didn't confirm Tirpitz's return to port until July 6th, by which point 17 merchant ships had already been sunk. Admiral Pound's decision to scatter the convoy had been based on the threat of Tirpitz, but that threat had disappeared within hours. The convoy had been sacrificed to a ghost. Post-war analysis revealed that if PQ-17 had stayed together with its escorts, losses would likely have been limited to 5 or 6 ships, roughly the same as previous convoys. The escorts had proven they could fight off air and submarine attacks. Concentrated anti-aircraft fire from escorts and merchant ships working together was effective. Scattered ships had no such protection and died easily. The decision to scatter has been debated by naval historians for 80 years. Some defend Admiral Pound, arguing that he made a reasonable decision based on the information available. Tirpitz was a genuine threat. The intelligence indicated she was heading toward the convoy. Keeping the convoy together risked total annihilation if Tirpitz arrived. Scattering at least gave some ships a chance to escape. Others condemned the decision as the worst mistake in Royal Navy convoy operations during the entire war. Pound ignored the advice of his staff. He overruled convoy doctrine. He scattered a convoy that was successfully fighting off attacks. He sent 31 defenseless merchant ships into an area swarming with German aircraft and U-boats. The result was predictable and catastrophic. The truth is probably somewhere between. Pound made a bad decision under enormous pressure with incomplete information. He was exhausted. He was suffering from an undiagnosed brain tumor that would kill him within a year. He was responsible for the entire Royal Navy during the worst naval war in history. He made a mistake. It cost 24 ships and 153 lives. 11 ships from Convoy PQ-17 reached Soviet ports. Their voyages were odysseys of survival. The American Liberty ship SS Samuel Chase hid in pack ice for 4 days, painted herself white, then made a run for Novaya Zemlya. She was bombed 3 times, damaged but not sunk, and limped into Arkhangelsk on July 11th, with half her cargo intact and her crew exhausted but alive. The British freighter SS Ocean Freedom ran close to shore, navigated through minefields, was attacked by aircraft 6 times, and somehow reached Arkhangelsk on July 9th. Her captain reported firing every anti-aircraft round aboard and estimated they shot down 2 German aircraft. The Soviet freighter SS Donbass fought off bombers, was torpedoed, caught fire, was abandoned, then reboarded when the crew realized she wasn't sinking. They fought fires for 12 hours, jury-rigged repairs, and sailed the damaged ship into Arkhangelsk on July 12th. The entire crew received Soviet medals for heroism. The American Liberty ship SS Ironclad hid in fog for 3 days, navigated using dead reckoning when the fog cleared, evaded U-boats by sheer luck, and reached Molotovsk on July 11th. The captain later said he expected to die every hour for 7 straight days. Some survivors were picked up by escorts that had stayed in the area despite orders to withdraw. HMS Lotus, a corvette, refused to abandon the convoy area and spent 5 days rescuing men from lifeboats and rafts. She pulled 84 survivors from the freezing water and delivered them to Arkhangelsk. The Soviet Navy sent submarines and patrol boats to search for survivors. They rescued dozens of men from lifeboats and rafts scattered across hundreds of miles. Some men had been in open boats for over a week, suffering from hypothermia, frostbite, and exposure. Many died after rescue, their bodies too damaged by cold to recover. The final casualty count was grim. 24 ships sunk, 153 men dead, 430 tanks lost, 210 aircraft lost, 99,316 tons of cargo destroyed. The material losses represented months of production. The human losses represented sailors from America, Britain, the Soviet Union, Panama, and the Netherlands, men from 6 nations who died because of a bad decision made in London. The survivors who reached Soviet ports spent weeks offloading cargo in primitive conditions at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Soviet authorities were suspicious and unhelpful. The ports had minimal facilities. Supplies had to be unloaded by hand and transported inland on damaged railways. Many surviving ships were damaged and needed repairs that Soviet shipyards couldn't provide. Some ships stayed in Russia for months. The crews were traumatized. They had watched ships burn. They had seen shipmates die. They had been bombed and torpedoed repeatedly. Many refused to sail on future Arctic convoys. Some suffered psychological breakdowns. Soviet authorities kept the foreign sailors under guard, treating them more like prisoners than allies. Relations between Western crews and Soviet officials were tense at best. When the surviving ships finally sailed home in return convoys, they faced the same dangers. Several were sunk on the return voyage. The Arctic route remained deadly for the entire war. The disaster of PQ-17 forced a complete reassessment of Arctic convoy operations. The Admiralty suspended all convoys to Russia for the rest of summer 1942. Stalin was furious, accusing Britain and America of abandoning the Soviet Union. Churchill had to personally explain to Stalin why the convoys were suspended, though he couldn't admit that British incompetence had caused the disaster. When convoys resumed in September 1942, procedures changed dramatically. Convoys would be smaller, 15 ships maximum. Escorts would be stronger, including escort carriers to provide air cover. Most importantly, there was a new standing order. Convoys would never scatter unless under direct attack by confirmed surface ships. The mere threat of surface ships was not sufficient reason to break up a convoy. Admiral Pound remained as First Sea Lord until October 1943, when his health failed. He resigned and died 3 weeks later from the brain tumor that had been affecting his judgment for over a year. There was never a formal inquiry into PQ-17 while he lived. The Admiralty protected him. Only after the war did the full story emerge. Captain Broom wrote a detailed report defending the merchant ship captains and criticizing the scatter order. His report was suppressed by the Admiralty. Broom was quietly sidelined and never given another major command. He retired in 1945, bitter and angry that the truth about PQ-17 was being covered up. Several merchant ship captains testified that the scatter order was the worst decision they had ever witnessed. They argued that staying together with escorts gave them a fighting chance. Scattering was suicide. Their testimony was ignored. The official Admiralty position was that the scatter order was justified given the intelligence available at the time. The truth about Tirpitz's brief sortie and quick return wasn't publicly revealed until German records were captured after the war. When historians finally pieced together what happened, the full scope of the disaster became clear. PQ-17 was destroyed not by superior German forces, but by a bad decision made in panic. The Soviet Union received less than 1/3 of the cargo that PQ-17 was carrying. The lost tanks and aircraft would have equipped several divisions. The lost trucks and supplies would have sustained armies for months. The material impact was significant, though not decisive. The Soviet Union was producing enough equipment domestically to continue fighting. But the symbolism mattered. The disaster suggested that Britain and America couldn't deliver supplies safely. It reinforced Stalin's suspicion that the Western Allies were letting the Soviet Union do most of the dying. The psychological impact on Allied sailors was severe. Arctic convoy duty had always been dangerous. After PQ-17, it was considered almost suicidal. Men volunteered less readily. Crews that were assigned to Arctic convoys knew they might be abandoned if things went wrong. Trust in Admiralty leadership was damaged. The disaster hung over Arctic convoy operations for the rest of the war. To understand how catastrophic PQ-17 was, compare it to other Arctic convoys. Convoy PQ-13, which sailed in March 1942, lost 5 of 19 ships, a 26% loss rate. Bad, but acceptable given the strategic need. Convoy PQ-16, which sailed in May 1942, lost 7 of 35 ships, a 20% loss rate. The convoy stayed together and the escorts protected it effectively. Convoy PQ-18, which sailed in September 1942 after procedures were changed, lost 13 of 40 ships, a 32% loss rate, heavy losses, but the convoy fought off massive German attacks while staying together. The escorts shot down 41 German aircraft. The defensive tactics worked. Convoy PQ-17 lost 24 of 35 ships, a 69% loss rate, more than twice the loss rate of any other convoy. The difference was the scatter order. Later convoys proved that concentrated defensive formations worked. Convoy JW-51B in December 1942 fought off an attack by German cruisers and destroyers. The escorts engaged the German surface ships, drove them away, and the convoy lost only one ship. Convoy RA-55A in December 1943 was attacked by a German surface force, including the battlecruiser Scharnhorst. British destroyers and cruisers engaged, sank Scharnhorst, and the convoy suffered no losses. The pattern was clear. Convoys that stayed together and were properly escorted had acceptable loss rates even against heavy German opposition. Convoys that scattered or lost their escorts were slaughtered. PQ-17 was the proof. The disaster of PQ-17 taught the Royal Navy several painful lessons about command and control. First, decisions made hundreds of miles from the action are often wrong. Admiral Pound was in London, reading intelligence reports, staring at maps. Captain Broom was on the bridge of HMS Keppel, watching the situation unfold in real time. Pound thought Tirpitz was about to attack. Broom saw a convoy successfully fighting off air and submarine attacks. Pound's decision overruled Broom's assessment. Pound was wrong. Second, doctrine exists for good reasons. Convoy tactics had been developed over centuries of naval warfare. Concentrated formations protected by escorts worked. Scattering was desperation, used only when escorts were already destroyed and the convoy was being overrun. PQ-17 wasn't being overrun. The scatter order violated doctrine and led directly to disaster. Third, incomplete intelligence is dangerous. The Admiralty knew Tirpitz had left port. They didn't know her orders were extremely restrictive. They didn't know she would turn back unless conditions were perfect. They made assumptions based on worst-case scenarios and acted on those assumptions without verifying them. The result was catastrophic. Fourth, admitting mistakes is essential. The Admiralty never formally acknowledged that the scatter order was wrong. They protected Pound, suppressed critical reports, and maintained the fiction that the decision was justified. That failure to admit error poisoned relationships with merchant sailors and damaged trust in leadership. The legacy of PQ-17 extended beyond the war. For decades, British naval historians debated the decision. Official histories were carefully worded to avoid directly blaming Pound. But merchant marine historians and survivors were less diplomatic. They called it what it was, a disaster caused by panic and bad judgment. In 1968, author David Irving published The Destruction of Convoy PQ-17, which argued that Pound made an inexcusable error. The book caused controversy. Some defenders of Pound sued Irving for libel. The case went to court. Irving won. The judge ruled that calling Pound's decision a mistake was fair comment supported by evidence. Today, PQ-17 is studied in naval academies as an example of how not to command. It shows what happens when centralized command overrules local commanders who have better situational awareness. It demonstrates the danger of making decisions based on threats rather than confirmed enemy actions. It proves that convoys work and scattering doesn't. The disaster also highlighted the incredible courage of merchant sailors. They weren't military personnel. They were civilians who volunteered to sail through war zones for regular wages. When ordered to scatter, they obeyed. They took their unarmed ships into waters full of U-boats and aircraft. They fought when they could, ran when they had to, and died alone in the Arctic Ocean. 153 men whose names should be remembered. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe and share this video. These stories matter because they teach us lessons that are still relevant today. Leadership matters, doctrine matters, trusting people on the ground matters, admitting mistakes matters. Convoy PQ-17 represents one of the most preventable disasters in naval history. The ships were lost not because German forces were overwhelming, but because British leadership panicked. 24 ships that could have reached Russia were destroyed. 153 men who could have survived died. Hundreds of tanks and aircraft that the Soviet Union desperately needed went to the bottom. The men who sailed with PQ-17 were ordinary sailors doing an extraordinary job. They volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the merchant marine. They knew the Arctic route was deadly. They sailed anyway because the Soviet Union needed supplies and somebody had to deliver them. They deserved better than to be scattered and abandoned in enemy waters. The 11 ships that survived did so through skill, courage, luck, and stubborn refusal to give up. Captains who painted their ships white and hid in ice. Engineers who kept damaged engines running past their limits. Gunners who fought off bombers with inadequate weapons. Crews who navigated through minefields and storms and reached port against all odds. They earned their survival. The 153 men who died in the Arctic Ocean deserve to be remembered. Many have no graves. Their ships are still on the bottom, scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean floor. Some died quickly when torpedoes struck. Some died slowly in lifeboats, freezing to death while rowing toward shores they would never reach. Some died fighting, manning guns until bombs silenced them. They were Americans, British, Soviets, Dutch, men from different nations, united in death by a decision made in London. Admiral Dudley Pound made a mistake. He was tired, sick, under enormous pressure, and dealing with incomplete information. He made a judgment call that turned out to be wrong. It happens in war. But the consequences were severe, and those consequences fell on men who had no say in the decision. The lesson of PQ-17 is that leadership failures kill. Bad decisions made far from the fighting destroy lives just as surely as enemy weapons. Intelligence that is incomplete leads to actions that are disastrous. Doctrine that is abandoned leads to tactics that don't work. And when leaders refuse to admit mistakes, those mistakes get repeated. The Arctic convoys continued for the rest of the war. Over 400 merchant ships sailed to Russia. 85 were lost. 29 men died. The supplies they delivered, 5,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft, millions of tons of food, fuel, and munitions, helped the Soviet Union survive and eventually defeat Germany. The convoys worked. They were deadly, but they worked. PQ-17 was an exception, a disaster that didn't have to happen. Remember the 11 ships that survived. Remember the 153 men who died. Remember that wars are won by good decisions and lost by bad ones. Remember that the men who sail into danger deserve leaders who make the right calls. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We preserve these stories because history's mistakes must be remembered so they're never repeated. These sailors died 82 years ago. We owe them the truth about what happened and why. They deserved better then. They deserve to be remembered now.